It was a cold autumn morning when Officer James Wilson began his regular patrol through the quiet streets of Riverdale. The neighborhood was just waking up as the sun peeked through the clouds. James had been a police officer for 12 years, and he knew these streets like the back of his hand. That morning felt different, though James couldn't explain why. He drove slowly past the row of small shops, nodding at the bakery owner who was opening up for the day. Everything seemed normal until he turned down Oak Street and heard something unusual. A faint cry caught his attention. At first, James thought it might be a cat. He stopped his patrol car and rolled down the window to listen more carefully. The sound came again, weak, but definitely not a cat. It sounded like a baby. James got out of his car and followed the sound to a narrow alley between two buildings. The crying grew louder as he walked deeper into the alley, past overflowing trash cans and discarded boxes. "Hello," he called out, but no one answered. Just the soft cries continued. His heart beat faster as he approached a large green dumpster where the sound seemed to be coming from. With a deep breath, James pushed aside some garbage bags and looked inside. What he saw made him freeze. There, wrapped in a dirty blanket, was a tiny baby. The infant's dark skin was turning slightly blue from the cold, and its cries were getting weaker by the minute. "Oh my God," James whispered. Without hesitation, he reached in and gently lifted the baby out. It was a little boy, probably no more than a few days old. The baby's eyes were shut tight as he cried, his tiny hands balled into fists. James quickly took off his jacket and wrapped it around the child. "It's okay, buddy. I got you now," he said softly, tucking the baby close to his chest for warmth. He radioed for an ambulance, his voice shaking as he reported finding an abandoned newborn. While waiting, James sat in his patrol car with the heater on full blast, rocking the baby gently. Who would do this to you? He wondered aloud, looking down at the innocent face. The baby had stopped crying and was now looking up at James with dark, curious eyes. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The paramedics took the baby, checking his vitals and placing him on a small stretcher. "He's dehydrated and cold, but he seems stable," one paramedic told James. "You found him just in time, officer." James nodded, unable to take his eyes off the child. "I'll follow you to the hospital," he said. He wasn't sure why, but he felt responsible for this tiny life he had found. At Riverdale General Hospital, doctors and nurses rushed to care for the baby. James stood outside the treatment room, watching through the window. A strange feeling settled over him, a mix of anger at whoever had abandoned this child and a powerful urge to protect him. "Officer Wilson." A social worker approached him with a clipboard. "I need some details about where you found the baby." James answered her questions mechanically, but his mind was elsewhere. As the social worker turned to leave, he asked, "What will happen to him now?" "He'll stay here until he's strong enough, then go into emergency foster care while we search for his parents," she explained. "If they can't be found or are deemed unfit, he'll eventually be placed for adoption." James nodded slowly. He walked to the window again and watched as a nurse fed the baby a bottle. Something about this child's survival against all odds touched him deeply. "I'll check on him tomorrow," James told the nurse at the desk, but in his heart, he knew he would be doing much more than just checking in. Officer James Wilson couldn't stop thinking about the baby boy he had rescued. The next morning, he found himself driving to Riverdale General Hospital before his shift, a small teddy bear sitting on the passenger seat beside him. At the hospital, James walked to the nursery section and asked the nurse at the desk about the abandoned baby. "He's doing much better today," the nurse told him with a smile. "The doctor says he's a fighter. Would you like to see him?" James nodded, surprised by how much he wanted to see the child again. The nurse led him to a small room where the baby lay in a special warming crib. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that beeped softly. "Can I?" James hesitated, then asked, "Can I hold him?" The nurse helped James sit in a rocking chair and placed the tiny baby in his arms. The child looked even smaller than James remembered. His dark skin was a warm brown now that he was getting proper care, and his eyes opened slightly as James held him. "Has anyone named him yet?" James asked, gently rocking back and forth. "Not officially. The nurses have been calling him Lucky because he was so lucky you found him when you did." James looked down at the baby, who had wrapped his tiny hand around James's finger. "Lucky," he repeated softly. "You deserve a real name, don't you, little guy?" For the next week, James visited the hospital every day. He would sit with the baby, sometimes talking to him about his day, sometimes just rocking in silence. The hospital staff began to recognize him, smiling when he arrived with small gifts, a soft blanket, tiny socks, a colorful mobile. During one visit, James met Sarah Johnson, a social worker assigned to the baby's case. "It's amazing how attached you become to him," Sarah observed as she watched James feed the baby a bottle. "I can't explain it," James admitted. "From the moment I found him, I just felt connected, like I was meant to find him." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "We haven't been able to locate his parents. We put out notices, but no one has come forward." James looked up, an idea forming in his mind. "What happens next?" "He'll go into the foster care system while we continue searching," Sarah explained. "If no family members come forward after a certain period, he'll be eligible for adoption." That evening, James arrived home to find his wife, Lisa, waiting for him at the kitchen table. They had been married for 8 years but hadn't been able to have children of their own. They had talked about adoption before, but never taken concrete steps. "You've been at the hospital again, haven't you?" Lisa asked softly. James sat down across from her. "Lisa, I need to talk to you about something important." He told her everything, about how he couldn't stop thinking about the baby, about the connection he felt, about his daily visits. As he spoke, Lisa reached across the table and took his hand. "I want you to meet him," James said finally. I think he could be our son." The next day, James brought Lisa to the hospital. She was nervous at first, but when the nurse placed the baby in her arms, tears filled her eyes. "Oh, James," she whispered. "He's perfect." 3 days later, James and Lisa sat in Sarah Johnson's office, filling out emergency foster care paperwork. The process would be long and complicated, but Sarah promised to help them every step of the way. "He needs a real name," Lisa said as they signed the initial documents. "Not just Lucky." James thought for a moment. "How about David? It means beloved." Lisa smiled. "David Wilson. I think it's perfect." As they left the social services office, James felt both excited and terrified. Their lives were about to change completely. But watching Lisa talk softly to the baby in her arms, he knew they were making the right choice. Little did James know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would bring great joy, and years later, heartbreaking news that would change everything. 6 months had passed since Officer James Wilson found baby David in that cold dumpster. The Wilson home was now filled with baby toys, colorful blankets, and the sweet sounds of David's laughter. The fostering process had not been easy. James and Lisa had to attend many meetings, complete stacks of paperwork, and open their home to regular visits from social workers. Because David was a black child and the Wilsons were white, they'd also had to take special cultural awareness classes. "We want to make sure we honored his heritage," Lisa had explained to her mother one afternoon as they watched David playing on a colorful mat. "It's important that he grows up knowing where he comes from." James nodded in agreement. "We've been learning so much. We've even connected with a local black community center that has programs for families like ours." David was growing quickly. His bright eyes followed people around the room, and his smile could light up even the darkest day. He had become the center of the Wilsons' world. One Tuesday morning, Sarah Johnson, their social worker, came for her monthly visit. She watched as James played peekaboo with David, the baby's giggles filling the living room. "I have some news," Sarah said as Lisa brought in coffee. "The search for David's biological parents has officially ended. No one has come forward, and we've exhausted all leads." James and Lisa exchanged looks. They had been waiting for this news with mixed emotions. Sadness for David that his birth family couldn't be found, but also hope for their own future with him. "What happens now?" James asked, lifting David onto his lap. "You can begin the formal adoption process," Sarah explained. "Given the circumstances and how well David is doing with you, I don't foresee any problems. But it will take time, probably another 6 months at least." That night, after putting David to bed, James and Lisa sat on their back porch talking about the future. "Once the adoption is final, he'll be ours forever," Lisa said, her voice filled with emotion. "No one can take him away." James nodded, but a small worry lingered in his mind. "I keep thinking about his birth mother. Why would someone leave their baby in a dumpster? Was she in trouble? Was she too young? Was she scared?" Lisa squeezed his hand. We may never know, but what we do know is that David will grow up loved and safe. And someday, when he's old enough, we'll tell them his story, the whole truth. Even the dumpster part? James asked. Even that, Lisa replied, because that's where his story with us began, where you saved his life. 2 weeks later, James was working the night shift when a call came in about a disturbance at an apartment complex across town. When he arrived, he found a young woman sitting on the curb crying. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "Ma'am, are you okay?" James asked, kneeling beside her. Between sobs, she explained that she had nowhere to go. Her boyfriend had kicked her out, and she was 8 months pregnant. James felt a chill run down his spine. This could have been David's mother, young, alone, desperate. He helped the woman into his patrol car and made some calls. By the end of his shift, he had connected her with a women's shelter that specialized in helping pregnant women in crisis. "If you need anything at all, call this number," he told her, handing her his card. "There are people who want to help." Driving home that morning, James thought about how different David's life could have been, how different it was now because of one moment, one choice, one twist of fate that had brought them together. At home, he found Lisa feeding David breakfast, the baby's face covered in applesauce as he banged his spoon happily on his high chair. "Everything okay?" Lisa asked, noticing James's thoughtful expression. James smiled, the weight of his night shift lifting as he watched his son. "Everything is perfect," he said, and he meant it. 5 years had passed since David officially became a Wilson. Now a lively 6-year-old with bright eyes and an even brighter smile, he filled the house with endless energy and questions about everything. "Daddy, why is the sky blue?" David asked one Saturday morning as James pushed him on the swing in their backyard. "Well, buddy, it's because of the way sunlight hits tiny particles in the air," James explained, giving him another push. "Light is made of different colors, and the blue part scatters more." David seemed to consider this seriously before breaking into giggles as he swung higher. "Push me higher, Daddy. I want to touch the blue." James laughed, his heart full. Moments like these made him forget the difficult journey they had traveled to become a family. The adoption had finally been completed when David was 18 months old, after a year of court visits, interviews, and anxious waiting. At school, David was thriving. His kindergarten teacher, Ms. Powell, had told them at the last parent-teacher meeting that he was reading at a second-grade level and showed natural talent for mathematics. "He's a very special boy," Ms. Powell had said, "but sometimes he gets quiet when the other children talk about their families." This had worried James and Lisa. They had always been open with David about being adopted, explaining it in simple terms. "You grew in another mommy's tummy, but you grew in our hearts." But they hadn't yet told him the full story of how he was found. One evening after dinner, David was coloring at the kitchen table while Lisa washed dishes and James dried them. "Tommy said I don't look like you," David said suddenly, not looking up from his drawing. "He said I can't be your real son because my skin is brown and yours is pink." James and Lisa exchanged glances. They had prepared for this moment, but it still caught them off guard. James sat down beside David. "Can I see what you're drawing?" David pushed his paper toward James. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall one with black hair like James, a medium one with yellow hair like Lisa, and a small brown figure in the middle. "That's our family," David said. "It's beautiful," James said. "And you know what? Tommy is right about one thing. You don't look like us on the outside, but families aren't just about looking the same." Lisa joined them at the table. "Remember how we told you that you're adopted? That means we chose each other, and that makes our family special." David nodded slowly. "But why didn't my first mommy want me?" The question hit James like a punch to the chest. He and Lisa had discussed how they would handle this moment, but now that it was here, the words stuck in his throat. Lisa spoke gently. "We don't know exactly why your birth mother couldn't take care of you, David. Sometimes grown-ups have very big problems that make it hard for them to be parents. What we do know," James added, finding his voice, "is that you were meant to be our son. The day I found you was the luckiest day of my life." David's eyes widened. "Found me? Like in hide and seek?" James took a deep breath. "Kind of. When you were a tiny baby, just a few days old, I was working as a police officer and I heard a sound. It was you crying. You needed help, and I found you." "Were you lost?" David asked. In a way, James said carefully, you were alone, and you needed a family, and we needed you. David seemed to accept this explanation for now. He picked up his crayon again and added a sun to his picture. I'm glad you found me, Daddy, he said simply. That night, after tucking David into bed, James stood in the doorway watching his son sleep. Lisa wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head on his shoulder. We'll tell him more when he's ready, she whispered. James nodded, one step at a time. What neither of them knew was that the hardest part of their journey still lay ahead, a truth that would shake their family to its core. David Wilson celebrated his 10th birthday with a superhero-themed party in the backyard. His friends from school ran around in colorful capes, while James flipped burgers on the grill and Lisa handed out slices of cake shaped like Batman's logo. Make a wish, honey, Lisa called as David stood before his cake, the 10 candles flickering in the afternoon breeze. David closed his eyes tightly, took a deep breath, and blew out all the candles in one go. His friends cheered and clapped. Later that night, after the party was over and the house was quiet again, James found David sitting on his bed, looking at a photo album. Did you have a good birthday, buddy? James asked, sitting beside him. David nodded without looking up. Dad, can I ask you something important? Of course. Anything. Tommy's mom had a new baby, and I went to see it at the hospital, David said slowly. The baby looked just like Tommy and his dad, same nose and everything. James felt his heart beat faster. Over the years, they had answered David's questions about his adoption as honestly as age-appropriate explanations would allow. But lately, his questions have been getting more specific. I was thinking about what you told me before, David continued. About finding me when I was a baby. But you never said where you found me or who my real mom was. James took a deep breath. First of all, Lisa and I are your real parents, David. We may not be your biological parents, the ones whose bodies you came from, but we're your real family. I know, David said quickly, but I want to know about my biological parents, especially my mother. James nodded. He and Lisa had discussed this moment many times, knowing it would eventually come. They had agreed to be truthful but careful. I found you when you were very small, just a few days old, James explained. You were alone in a place where babies shouldn't be. Someone had left you there. Left me where? David pressed. James looked into his son's eyes. In an alley, in a trash container. David's eyes widened. Someone threw me away? Like garbage? No, buddy, James said quickly, putting his arm around David's shoulders. I don't think anyone was throwing you away. I think your biological mother was probably very young and very scared. She might not have known what else to do. Is she dead? David asked bluntly. We don't know, James admitted. The police and social workers tried to find her, but they couldn't. David was quiet for a long time, staring at the photo album in his lap. It was open to a picture of him as a toddler, sitting on James's shoulders at the zoo. I want to find her, he said finally. I want to know who she is and why she left me. James had known this day would come, but it still caught him off guard. That might be very difficult, David. It was a long time ago, and we don't have much information. But we could try, right? David looked up with determination in his eyes. Maybe there's DNA tests or something. I learned about those in science class. James nodded slowly. Yes, there are tests like that. But finding someone takes time, and we might not get the answers you're hoping for. Are you sure this is what you want? I'm sure, David said. I just want to know where I came from. That night, James talked with Lisa about David's request. They sat at the kitchen table long after David had gone to bed. He's getting older. He deserves to know his story, Lisa said. The worry lined her face. But what if we find something painful? James asked. What if his mother didn't want to be found? Then we'll face that together, as a family, Lisa replied, taking his hand. But David needs this, James. He needs to know who he is. The next day, James made a call to Sarah Johnson, the social worker who had helped them adopt David years ago. The search for David's biological family was about to begin, and none of them could predict where it would lead, or the heartbreaking news that awaited them down the road. 2 years had passed since David first asked about finding his biological mother. Now 12 years old, he had grown taller, his voice occasionally cracking as he entered the early stages of puberty. The search had moved slowly, with many disappointing dead ends. Sarah Johnson, the social worker who had helped with David's adoption, had been working with the Wilsons to follow every possible lead. They had submitted David's DNA to several ancestry databases and waited hopefully for matches. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Sarah had explained during one of her visits to the Wilson home. Without any information about David's birth mother, or depending on someone related to her having their DNA in the system. David had been patient at first, but as months turned into years, he began to lose hope. James noticed his son becoming quieter, more withdrawn. He spent more time alone in his room, and his grades at school had started to slip. One evening in late autumn, James's phone rang while he was helping David with math homework at the kitchen table. He didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. "Mr. Wilson, this is Sarah Johnson. I need to speak with you and Lisa as soon as possible. We've had a development in David's case." James felt his heart skip a beat. "What kind of development?" "I'd rather discuss it in person," Sarah said. "Could I come by tomorrow morning?" That night, James could barely sleep. He tossed and turned, wondering what Sarah had discovered. Had they found David's mother? A relative? Was it good news or bad? The next morning, Sarah arrived at 9:00 a.m. sharp. David had already left for school, so the three adults sat in the living room, cups of coffee growing cold in their hands. "We had a DNA match," Sarah said, opening her folder. "A woman named Tamika Johnson. According to the test, she's David's biological aunt, his mother's sister." Lisa gasped softly. "You found his family?" Sarah nodded. Tamika was looking for her sister, Keisha, who disappeared about 12 years ago. When she submitted her DNA, it matched with David's. "Have you spoken to her?" James asked, his throat tight. "Yes," Sarah said, her expression growing serious. "And this is where things get difficult. I've learned the full story of what happened to David's mother." Sarah explained that Keisha Johnson had been only 17 when she got pregnant with David. She came from a troubled home and had been living on the streets for several months. Her family had been looking for her but couldn't find her. According to Tamika, Keisha struggled with drug addiction, Sarah continued. She had no prenatal care and was completely alone when she gave birth. James closed his eyes, imagining a frightened teenager giving birth with no help, no support. The image broke his heart. "What happened to her?" Lisa asked softly. "Is she still alive?" Sarah looked down at her papers. "This is the hardest part of what I have to tell you. Keisha was found dead in an abandoned building 3 weeks after David was born. The medical examiner determined she died of a drug overdose." The room fell silent. James felt as if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. This was what they had feared most, that David would learn his mother had died without ever having the chance to meet her. "Does Tamika want to meet David?" Lisa asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Sarah said. "She and her family have been searching for Keisha and any child she might have had for years. They never gave up hope." James stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard where David had played as a small child. "How do we tell him? How do we tell our son that his birth mother died alone, that she never had a chance to change her mind about leaving him?" "We tell him the truth," Lisa said firmly. "But we also make sure he knows that Keisha must have loved him in her own way. She put him where he could be found. She gave him his best chance." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And now he has more family who want to know him, people who share his blood and his history." James turned back to face them, tears in his eyes. "When should we tell him?" "Soon," Sarah said. "Tamika is eager to meet him. She has photos of Keisha she wants to share with him." As Sarah prepared to leave, she handed James a sealed envelope. "Tamika asked me to give this to David. It contains a letter and a picture of his mother." James took the envelope with trembling hands, knowing that the contents would forever change his son's life and their family. That evening, James and Lisa sat David down in the living room. The envelope from Tamika lay on the coffee table between them. David looked at it with curious eyes, not yet understanding how much his world was about to change. "David, remember how we've been searching for information about your birth family?" Lisa began gently. David nodded, sitting up straighter. "Did you find something?" James took a deep breath. "Yes, son, we found your mother's sister, your biological aunt. Her name is Tamika Johnson." David's eyes widened. "Really? She's looking for me?" "She was looking for her sister, your birth mother," James explained. Her name was Keisha Johnson. She was very young when she had you, only 17. David leaned forward, eager for more information. What was she like? Where is she now? Can I meet her? James and Lisa had exchanged a painful glance. This was the moment they had dreaded. David, Lisa said softly, moving to sit beside him on the couch. I'm afraid we have some sad news about your birth mother. James watched as his son's face changed, the excitement fading into worry. What happened to her? Keisha had a very hard life, James explained, choosing his words carefully. She didn't have a good home or people to help her. She got involved with drugs when she was very young. Was that why she left me in the trash? David asked, his voice small. She was alone and scared, Lisa said, putting her arm around David's shoulders. She was probably not thinking clearly because of the drugs and because she had just given birth with no help. David was quiet for a moment, processing this information. So where is she now? James moved to sit on David's other side, creating a circle of support around him. David, Keisha died a few weeks after you were born. She had taken too many drugs and her body couldn't handle it. The words hung in the air. David's face crumpled, tears filling his eyes. She's dead? All this time I've been looking for someone who's been dead for 12 years? I'm so sorry, buddy, James said, his own voice breaking. David jumped up from the couch, anger replacing his sadness. Why didn't you tell me before? Why did you let me hope I could meet her someday? We didn't know, Lisa explained, tears streaming down her face. We just found out ourselves. David paced the room, his hands clenched into fists. So she abandoned me and then died. She never even tried to find me again. James stood and placed his hands gently on David's shoulders, stopping his pacing. David, look at me. Your mother was a child herself, dealing with addiction and homelessness. She wasn't able to take care of herself, let alone a baby. But she put me in the trash. David cried, the pain in his voice cutting through James's heart. She put you somewhere she knew you would be found. James corrected gently. The alley where I found you was behind a busy restaurant. People were coming and going all the time. She could have left you somewhere much more isolated, but she didn't. I think, in her own way, she was trying to give you a chance. David collapsed back onto the couch, his anger giving way to deep sobs. Lisa held him close, rocking him like she had when he was small. It's not fair, he whispered between sobs. I'll never get to meet her. I'll never know if she wanted me at all. James picked up the envelope from the table and sat down next to his son. Your Aunt Tamika sent this for you. It has a picture of your mother and a letter about her. David took the envelope with shaking hands but didn't open it. Is Tamika nice? Sarah says she's very kind, Lisa assured him. She's been looking for you and your mother for many years. She wants to meet you when you're ready. Will I have cousins? David asked, wiping his tears. James nodded. 3 cousins, according to Sarah, and a grandfather too. David looked down at the envelope, running his fingers over the seal. I have a family I never knew about. You have 2 families now, James said. The one you were born into and the one that chose you, both full of people who love you. That night, David fell asleep on the couch between James and Lisa, the unopened envelope clutched to his chest. The path ahead would not be easy, but they would walk it together, helping their son understand both where he came from and where he belonged. 6 months had passed since David learned the truth about his birth mother. At 13, he was growing taller every day, his voice deepening, his shoulders broadening as he transitioned from boy to teenager. The meeting with Tamika Johnson and her family had gone better than anyone expected. David had been nervous at first, clinging to James and Lisa as they entered the restaurant where the meeting was arranged. But Tamika's warm smile and tear-filled eyes had quickly put him at ease. You look so much like her, Tamika had whispered when she first saw David. You have Keisha's eyes, exactly the same. That day had been filled with stories, photos, and gentle introductions to cousins who shared David's features in subtle ways, the shape of an ear, the curve of a smile, the pattern of freckles across a nose. Now, on a bright spring morning, David stood in front of his middle school auditorium, smoothing down his shirt as he prepared to give a speech. The school was hosting a Community Heroes Day, and students had been asked to speak about someone who had made a difference in their lives. James and Lisa sat in the front row, hands clasped together tightly. Beside them sat Tamika and her family, now a regular presence in the Wilsons' lives. The principal called David's name, and he walked to the podium with confident steps. "My hero doesn't wear a cape," David began, his voice clear and strong. "But he does wear a uniform. My father, Officer James Wilson, is my hero not just because he's a police officer who helps people every day, but because 10 years ago he saved my life in a way that most people will never understand." From his seat, James felt his throat tighten with emotion. David had not told them what his speech would be about. "I was born to a young woman named Keisha Johnson," David continued. "She was only 17, alone, and struggling with drug addiction. On a cold morning in October, just days after I was born, she made a desperate choice. She wrapped me in a thin blanket and placed me in an alley behind a restaurant, hoping someone would find me." The auditorium was completely silent now, every person hanging on David's words. That someone was Officer James Wilson, who heard my cries while on patrol. He didn't just call for help. He stayed with me, kept me warm, and made sure I was safe. And then he did something even more extraordinary. He and his wife Lisa opened their home and their hearts to me. They became my parents. David paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. 6 months ago, I learned that my birth mother died shortly after leaving me in that alley. I was angry at first, angry that she left me, angry that she died before I could meet her, angry that drugs took her away. But my dad helped me understand something important. My mother made the best choice she could in that moment. She gave me a chance at life. James felt Lisa's hand tighten around his own. Beside them, Tamika wiped tears from her eyes. "My father taught me that heroes don't always make dramatic rescues or fight villains. Sometimes being a hero means making hard choices with compassion. My birth mother was a hero too, in her own way. Despite her struggles, she placed me where I could be found. And my father was the one who found me." David looked directly at James now, his eyes shining. "Dad, you didn't just save me once when you found me in that alley. You saved me every day by being my father, by teaching me what it means to be a good man, and by helping me understand my story. All of it, even the hard parts. You showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about love and choices and sticking together through difficult times." As David finished his speech, the auditorium erupted in applause. James stood up, tears streaming down his face, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. When David returned to his seat, James pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "I'm proud of us," David replied. "Our whole family." That evening, they celebrated with both sides of David's family, the Wilsons and the Johnsons, together around one table. As James looked around at these people connected by one boy, he thought about the long, sometimes painful journey that had brought them all together. What had begun as a tragedy, a baby abandoned, a young mother lost, had transformed into something beautiful, a family circle, now complete.